Hello, and welcome everyone to Pandemonium U. My name is Pamela Druckerman. I'm coming to you direct from Paris, quarantine in Paris. Pandemonium U, for those of you who don't know, is an online university, entre guillemets, that we started about 5 weeks ago in the first days of confinement, thinking that we know all these wonderful people and we'd like to bring them to the other wonderful people that we know. So thank you for being here. If you're not on our mailing list yet, our email address is pandemoniumu2020@gmail.com. Send us a note and we'll make sure you hear about all the coming events. We also have an Instagram page managed by my daughter. It's pandemonium_u and a Facebook page. So it is a great pleasure for me to bring to you today Benjamin Moser, direct from quarantine in the south of France. In his living room. There's an unknown item behind him. I guess I'll reveal later what it is. Ben is someone who I've known for many years and at first thought was kind of a nice Jewish boy from Texas, and then realized gradually that there are so many people inside of him. I was once sitting with Ben in a sauna, and a Cuban lady came in, and he, even though I didn't even know that Ben spoke Spanish, began speaking not just perfect Spanish to her, but perfect Cuban Spanish. And he has like a Dutchman inside him. He has definitely a very specific type of Brazilian inside him. And I think this skill as a kind of shapeshifter who's deeply curious about other people's lives makes him an amazing biographer. It's almost as if he's an actor who's able to go inside the soul of another person. And I find this really intriguing and scary and mysterious about him. And he brings it just beautifully to bear on the page. So Ben, thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. It's great to be here. I'm really a Renaissance man, and I have a new person inside me, Pamela.
Who's that?
I'm presenting my first self haircut. I did this just for Pandemonium University, so I hope everybody is proud of the results. You can't really see it, and the screen's kind of grainy, which I think helps my cause.
Very well done. No huge damage, I would say. Ben, just to start us off on your work as a biographer, because your first biography was of Clarice Lispector, who, you know, as somebody like you who studied Latin American literature and history, you were very familiar with. She's in Brazil. She's basically like the Kafka of Brazil, or she's the Brazilian Borges, but that nobody in America had ever heard of. She hadn't been translated into English, but you could read Portuguese, and you started reading her. How did you kind of discover her, and what did you think when you started reading this woman who you had never heard of?
I had never heard of her, and I fell into studying Portuguese purely by accident during my first year of college. I had planned to study Chinese, and I failed in this really embarrassing way. After just a couple of weeks, I realized this was never going to happen. And I wanted to take another language, and the only one at that time slot was Portuguese. And I had never thought about Portuguese or Brazil or Portugal or anything. And I walked into the room, and pretty soon after that, we were able to start reading short books. And one of them was The Hour of the Star by Clarice Lispector, who I'd never heard of. But there was this woman that has this, just her appearance on the back picture was so captivating to me. She looked straight at me. And then we'll show the picture that I first saw of her in a minute. But, and then I started reading her, and I just never read anything like it. And so I was 19 at the time. No, I was 17 at the time. I started college a little bit early. And I never really got over her, but I also didn't really know, because people didn't know who she was. I didn't know how to explain her to people.
Did you trust that what you judged as like this incredible quality of writing was true? Did you trust yourself?
Well, I mean, I wasn't the first person to discover her. I mean, she was widely known among people who speak Portuguese as the greatest writer, maybe, you know, in their whole language. Certainly in the modern literature of Brazil, there's nobody that's even close to her. And so I knew that, but it's a question of how do you communicate that to other people in a different language? Yeah. And so that's why I chose to do it in a biography.
So she was famous not just as a writer, but also as a person, because she was so beautiful, and she had this aura of mystery that sort of comes across in every photo of her. There's one line from your biography where she goes in the 40s to see the Sphinx in Egypt. And she apparently stared at the Sphinx and she said of the Sphinx, "I did not decipher her, but neither did she decipher me." You know, she was somebody who you couldn't quite get close enough to. Was that something that drew you to her as well?
Absolutely. And you want to get close to her because she's so fascinating and she's so compelling and the books are so beautiful. And you kind of can't believe you've never heard of her. You can't believe that somebody who's this fabulous a writer wouldn't be world famous. But that's another reason. I mean, often writers that write in languages, even languages with millions, hundreds of millions of speakers like Portuguese, sometimes don't cross the barrier. So that's what I have been trying to do with her for 20 years. I mean, I first wrote Why This World, my biography of her. And then I've been heading up this project at New Directions and at Penguin in the UK for, yeah, I mean, it's what, 15 years? It's like 12 volumes we've published of her writing so that now people can actually see what's so special about her.
So tell us a little bit about how you got started on the biography. You were young, you had never written a book before, you had no credentials as a biographer, right? How did you get started?
I had no credentials, period. Like I started this when I was like 25. It's really funny, like when I see pictures of myself, I was really young and sort of, actually we'll show a picture of me with Clarice's sister in a minute, but I can't believe anybody thought I was anybody worth talking to, you know? Like I was just this bright-eyed kid and I showed up in Brazil and I just started reading books and then I started finding out who was who in this world, who's the family, who are the scholars, who are the friends, who are, you know, and then you start learning those things. And then the more you get into that world, the quicker it goes.
But so was the key person that you met in her life her sister? Did you need, like, did you want to write an authorized biography? How did it work?
No, I didn't even know what that was. Now I do. Now I know a lot about the ins and outs of these things. I didn't know anything at the time. I just thought, isn't it great that I want to write a biography of this person? Aren't they going to be really happy? And
So
now that's so naive. Can people hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, you froze a little bit. It seems really naive just to show up in some other country and just start talking to people, basically calling them out of the blue. But the thing is, once you have a couple of contacts, they say, oh, you should talk to my friend so-and-so. And then you go to the friend so-and-so and they say, oh, well, you know who really knows about that is this lady down the street. And that's how it goes, because everybody, even very famous people, this is one thing you learn, even very famous people inhabit pretty small communities. Like people don't have, I mean, now we do on Facebook and stuff, but people don't have 5,000 friends. They have like 40 friends if they're lucky.
So to be a biographer is almost like to be a journalist, writing a profile, like you go around and just interview tons of people. Is that how you started out with Clarice?
That's how I started out. And I was just really excited that they wanted to talk to me. And I was really nervous about it. And I grew up, so my grandfather was a refugee from Nazi Germany. And so I had known sort of how, I didn't know that I knew this, but I figured out, I knew what a lot of refugees and Jewish refugees in particular were like. And I didn't know I knew that, but I knew that you had to go to their house and listen to them show pictures of their grandchildren for hours after hours. And like, if they offered you another piece of cake, like you have to take the extra piece of cake because otherwise they're going to be offended. Like there's a sort of thing. And I didn't realize that I had all these skills just from sort of growing up around parts of my relatives. But then you just start talking to people and then you see where your interests. I think this session's called How to Write a Biography. I think one of the things that you learn is that so much stuff comes at you when you're doing this kind of investigation that you can't cover it all. You have to sort of concentrate on the things that you're interested in.
Should we share a picture now of Clarice? Ben?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Oh, so this is the picture. Yeah, I wanted to show this picture. This is the, actually go back.
Sorry.
This is the picture that was on the back of that first book that I encountered of her. And I just thought she was the most fascinating looking person I'd ever seen. And as it turns out, she is. And not only, I feel this way, but any Brazilian who has ever felt the appeal of her feels this very strong, this connection, like she's looking right through you. It's very hard to...
Her story is a refugee story, right? Maybe you could say a little bit about her
Well,
background.
this is what's so interesting. So if you know Latin America, she reads in this picture as a wealthy upper class Latin American. In fact, she started life as a penniless refugee from racism and pogroms in Ukraine, where she was born in 1920, and her family fled, and she arrived in Brazil as a child. She was just a year old when she got to Brazil, and she grew up in circumstances of real grinding poverty. And she grew up very quickly. People were fascinated by her in the way I was. You know, even people she met in middle school or high school knew she was really special. So if you can go back to that other picture. Yeah, so this is Clarice, you know, age 16 or 17 in Rio, right when she's about to start writing her first things. And you can see the éclat of this girl, the beauty of her, and how you just kind of keep looking at her and want to know more about her. And that feeling is actually the feeling that a biographer should have. You know, you want to get closer, you want to know what's behind this and like who this person is. It is in that sense kind of like falling in love with somebody. You want to know more about them. So it takes a long time if you want to do it in the way that a real biography does. And maybe we should show her. Do you have the video? I just wanted to show. So one of the really famous things about her is that she was this legendary figure like Emily Dickinson or Thomas Pynchon or somebody that never went on TV. And right before her death, she already had cancer. She's only 56 when she died, but she showed up at the studio in Sao Paulo just with this woman that was her friend and her driver. And she walked into the studio and she said, "Okay, you can interview me now." And this was...
She'd never been interviewed on film before.
Sorry?
This is the only existing interview with her on film.
The only one. And the guy who interviewed her was absolutely overwhelmed by this opportunity. You know, he said, "There's not an interview of Kafka or Dostoevsky or Fernando Pessoa, and I'm the one that's going to do Clarice Lispector, and I have half an hour." And he felt really, afterwards, he felt like he'd fucked it up, or he'd not done a good job. And he felt really bad about that. And he wrote all these essays about he should have asked this and he should have asked that, and he failed in the eyes of history. But let's see it. It's a fabulous interview.
But for you as her biographer, this is, I mean, have you watched this hundreds of times to try to find clues about, because by the time you were writing about her, she had been dead for many years.
Yeah, she died right after I was born. And she, I was born in 1976. She was born in 1977, or she died in 1977. And she, if you see her, there is a lot you can see in this thing we're gonna show. You can see, first of all, if you have in mind this very glamorous, beautiful woman, you can see how hard her life has been by the end of her life. And you can also see at a certain point she'll light a cigarette, and you can see that her hand is wounded. She actually fell asleep when she was in her mid-40s. She fell asleep smoking, and she burned her hand. So you can see, but you can also see these eyes and this voice, which, if you know Portuguese, she has a very pronounced, strange accent. So let's just watch a little bit of it.
Okay. Ben, are you there?
Hello.
Hey.
Oh yeah, okay.
It's funny because we haven't really talked about what her writing is like, but she's a kind of, is it fair to say like a magical realist writer? Because it seems like she thinks as a magical realist.
No, she's not a magical realist. She's, that's her generation of Latin American writers. So that's one reason she didn't get so, she didn't really enter the first wave of popularity internationally of Latin American writers, because they expected a certain thing of a Latin American. She turns out to be a Jewish mystic from Eastern Europe, which is completely bizarre if you see these pictures of this woman and you think, oh, that's a fancy lady from Rio, which she was. She was also like a bearded saint from Podolia, which is a part of Ukraine, of Western Ukraine, that was one of the poorest and most isolated regions of all of Europe, and that also had a tradition that goes back very far of religious mysticism and a desire to know God directly. So her books are often, if you can say, it's a desire to get close to the real heart of being and ask questions that you don't really ask. You know, my book is called Why This World, which is a quote from her. She asks questions like, why is the world here? Why are we born? Why do we die? And there are questions that are so basic that you almost would be embarrassed to ask them, but she wasn't embarrassed to ask them. And you see this kind of intense sincerity in the way she speaks.
Were you worried as her biographer? I mean, you seem very taken by her. You're kind of mesmerized by her beauty and by her talent and by her mystery. Like, were you worried that you were losing your critical distance at any point, that you would sort of fall in for Clarice?
I don't really believe in critical distance. I think it's kind of overrated in a certain sense. I think you should write about things that you are really, really fascinated by. You can also, you know, even with people, for example, that we love, you know, we all have our little thoughts about the people we love. We know when they're not doing something right. And, you know, you can say that, and there are ways that you can say it that are aggressive and that are designed to take people down. And then there are ways that are often designed to think along with the person and think like, you know, like, why does this book not work as well as the last book? Or why is this character not as convincing? Or why did people react one way to this and not the other? I mean, so there's all sorts of ways as a biographer that you can do that respectfully and not sacrifice either your own opinion, which people sometimes do, and I find kind of boring in biographies, frankly, but still loving the person. I mean, if I hadn't loved Clarice Lispector, there would be no point to write about her.
Mm-hmm. But what about, I mean, this, as a journalist, I have this problem often, which is that you interview people and they trust you and you feel sympathy for the people you interview. And so then you don't want to, you sort of want to please them in the right, I mean, did you feel this in writing the biography that, you know, you'd been brought into the family and you became friendly with the sister, and I think also with her, Clarice's son, did you feel an obligation to them to tell a version of the story that they would be happy with?
Well, not really. I mean, yes, in a way you do it first. The thing about a biography that you realize is that people are never actually worried about the things that you think they're going to be worried about. So, I mean, the two examples that everybody thinks are, you know, the classic things that people are worried about are sex and money, right? Turns out, in my experience, which is now long of, you know, what, 15 years of writing biographies, that's not what people care about. Because, you know, grown-ups, especially when you're talking about people in their 80s or 90s, they've been around. They know that life is hard in a lot of ways and that people go up and down. For writers, it's often things like bad reviews. Like somebody will be really angry about a review from 1957. And it's like, I mean, I'm a writer, you're a writer. Like, you know, like some reviews you just hate, you know, and some are like, okay. But others really get to you. But other things, you know, really little personal things, like descriptions of people's clothing or people's, I don't know.
Yeah, hug up on little things.
Yeah. But so I don't really think I think that you can try to guess that as a biographer, but if you do, you're going to be wrong. So you might as well just write what you want to write.
It's almost like a level that you have to go through, the concern, and then you get to the other side in which you are just writing freely and you've gotten past other people's voices, and you're just in your own head writing the book.
Well, this is one of the hardest things about writing biography is so many voices in your head, because so many people talk to you. And, you know, Clarice actually was not a particularly controversial person. Everybody in Brazil knew that she was a great writer. She wasn't particularly controversial politically, or, you know, she didn't have like a record of crime. I mean, you know, all the things.
Isn't there like a statue of her sitting on a bench where you can like
come and sit and
Yeah, I should have put
take
that
a
picture. I thought about it. Oh yeah, that's a fascinating thing. So on the beach in Rio, near where she lived, there's a statue of her and her dog. And she's just sitting there with the dog. And my partner and I once went there and sat across from it and just watched people coming up. I mean, this is part of its Instagram, and part of it is this real connection people have with her. People would come up all afternoon and just sit there and talk to her. It's an unbelievable thing. It's so touching, and you can't actually believe people bring her flowers. People bring her.
Let me ask you something, Ben. When you got to the end of the process of writing the biography, and we'll move on in a second to Susan, did you feel like you had cracked the nut that is Clarice Lispector? Did you know who she was? Were you?
Yeah, I think I did in a certain way. I mean, I don't really believe in totally cracking the nut. And especially with somebody as profound and as radical as she is, intellectually and philosophically, there's a lot there. And, I've been working on these translations now for all these years, and every time I reread these books, they're so incredibly good and fascinating and rich. But I do think that I got to do what I wanted to do, which was kind of understand a certain side of her, a certain aspect of her, and also be able to communicate that. And I'm really proud that after this book and after all the other books that we've published, she's become much better known, and people don't look at you like you're crazy, because they did when I started.
Because so when you started in this biography, you didn't, as far as I understand, you didn't have a book contract. You just started writing a biography of her as on your own. But then when it was published, which was soon after I met you, it was on the cover of the New York Times Book Review. It was suddenly like you brought her. Suddenly everyone was reading Clarice Lispector. What was that like for you?
It was crazy. When I think about that, I started off doing that with no contract, with no experience, with no knowledge of anything, and that it actually worked. Because that was, of course, my dream, that it would be successful and everybody would read her and people would be interested in her and she would take the place that she deserves to have, which is as one of the great modern writers. And it worked, and I couldn't believe that it worked. I was appalled in a way, because it seemed like almost like an inside joke, because it was so weird that she wasn't already known. It's like that I was going to be the guy to make that happen. I never really, but you take a bet on things sometimes.
Should we show just the rest of the slides?
Oh yeah, we had a couple more pictures, right? Yeah. Let's see. Okay, so here she is again. We saw her. Oh, this is kind of funny. I think it's funny. This is me at age, whatever I was, 25, in Podolia, wearing a kippah. I don't know if you can see that. About to go visit the tomb of the Baal Shem Tov, who's the great founder of Hasidism. Not Hasidism like unorthodox, with big hats, but Hasidism, the mystical movement that was founded in Ukraine and Poland in the 18th century. And I don't know, this is just kind of fun that you get to go to these places that you would never ever have a reason to go. I mean, unless you're a very Orthodox Hasidic pilgrim, you're probably not going to go to this village in the middle of nowhere in Ukraine. But
this was the village that she left as a baby, basically.
No, this is next to it. This is very close, but this is just to show the connection of her with the mystics of old Eastern Europe. But it's really, a biography is a great thing. You just meet people and you go places, and it's the least lonely form of writing in a way. Mm-hmm. So maybe go on to the next one and I'll show you another example. So this is me, like fresh-faced Eagle Scout from Houston. This is Tanya, who was Clarice's sister, and who was in her 90s. This was the year before she died. And she was really just the nicest lady in the world. It was really funny because I realized that there was this connection among the Jewish world that I hadn't really realized, because she spoke with she didn't have the funny accent that Clarice had, but she had a very pronounced Northeastern accent from Recife in northern Pernambuco, Brazil, which is a very distinctive accent if you know Portuguese. My grandmother, who was from Texas, talked like a lady from Houston. But it was so weird sitting there and realizing they weren't the same person, but they had a very, very similar cultural background in a way you just wouldn't have, like the things they said were the same things, the things they were worried about, like whether I had a sweater on or whether I had enough Coke or whether I was, going to make sure to call the taxi that was the safe taxi company and not the dangerous taxi company. Like, it was really funny. And I realized that I actually knew a lot more about this than I thought.
But do you feel like you were sort of playing the adorable Jewish grandson card in order to sort of win your way into their lives and their confidences?
I was an adorable Jewish grandson. I mean, like, it wasn't an act, you know, like I always really liked these kind of women, especially. I liked hearing the stories. And once you do, another thing about biographies, I think that's interesting, is you realize how many people really want to tell their stories. They don't. I felt really, you know, kind of ginger. I didn't really want to barge into people's houses and ask all these really personal questions, because biographies are about personal questions. I mean, that's what they are. And then I realized that once they got comfortable with me, they actually really liked telling their stories. And, you know, Clarice, like, for the Jews of Brazil particularly, she's this figure of great pride. You know, it's like if Shakespeare was Jewish, you know, to have the most important writer in your country be this Jewish girl who came to Brazil as a refugee is really something people want to honor. And
but so, she was also personally obsessed with trying to prove that she was really Brazilian, and people sort of, I
don't think she was obsessed with it, but, you know, Brazil was a country that didn't have this kind of ideal of diversity. I mean, they had a specific kind of diversity, which was Black, Indian, Portuguese, and that was sort of the three components of the nation. But people always asked her, and still to this day, they'll say in these, like, in anything that she's written up, any newspaper article, it'll say, like, the naturalized Ukrainian Brazilian writer Clarice Lispector. Really, it's weird. And I think, like, she was constantly confronted with that question of where she belonged.
Let's move on to your next work. I mean, because at this point, when you started with Susan, they came to you, right, for your next biography? You were now an established writer who wrote about women's lives.
Well, so I just wanted to show these two pictures. This is the British paperback, and this is on the left is the the American paperback. And you see Susan is her whole work, not her whole work, but a lot of her work is about photography and how people look different depending on how they're photographed. And I thought this was a kind of interesting example of that. The Clarice biography, which surprised everyone, including me, with its success, led me to be asked to write about Susan Sontag, which was really exciting for me. Because, of course, if you're interested in this world of the great women intellectuals, and I realized doing both of these books, but already by Clarice, just how much is not said about these lives and how interesting they are and how much is really shocking about them. I mean, sometimes you're reading about somebody who looks like, if you look at Susan here, she looks really contemporary. But in fact, you know, she occupied a world that I think even we don't realize how hard it is to imagine the world that she came from and the world she inhabited, even though she only died 15 years ago.
The thing that strikes me about the difference between the two women is Clarice is so, like, lovable and intriguing, and whereas Sontag is a really tough character. She alienated a lot of people. She could be extremely abrasive. I mean, was it hard for you to transition from someone who was so easy to like to someone who was so complicated?
Well, not really. I don't mind that. I'm not afraid of these larger than life women. And I think that when you're writing this kind of thing, you're not really trying to judge these people. You're trying to kind of understand what made them tick. And again, it's this thing about being an adult. You know, you understand that, like, people's lives are hard and people remember gossip that's negative way more than they remember gossip that's positive. People love gossiping about famous people. And I was sort of intrigued. I mean, Susan was this, you know, monstre sacré. You know, she really was like this great, great woman who was incredibly kind and incredibly generous and helpful and nice to people. And she was also somebody who, especially as she got older, could be really terrible. But I don't know, I sort of like that. It's like, in a sense, these characters, they're real people, but they're also novelistic characters when they become a biography, because a biography is it's not 100% of who the person is. You know, it's a character in a sense, because it's a book. It's one person's perspective about something. So to have somebody who's so larger than life, who's such a famous diva, and to be able to write about her, it's really actually great. Like, it's so much better than if she was boring. You know, some writers stay home and they write their books and it's fine, but it's not as interesting for a biography. You know, the books that they write can actually be better, but the biography can be more interesting.
And so can you talk us through, you were approached by her family to become her official biographer. And then what did they gave you the keys to the kingdom? What did they give you to work with?
Yeah, well, I'll show that a little bit. I said that I would do it, you know, if I had this 100% freedom. Now, I realized after the Clarice biography, during it, how naive I had been. I didn't realize how many legal impediments there are. Luckily, Clarice's son, who's a great friend of mine, now, you know, he wasn't then, he didn't sue me. He didn't ruin my life. He could have, you know, I mean, in Brazil, the laws against the libel laws and the laws about, you know, how the many ways that you can screw around with people legally. Right. I didn't know. So I got this assurance. And so if you want to go ahead to the next slide, I'll show you one of the things I got. Oh, wait, maybe keep going.
Okay. Look at that.
Oh, yeah. So this is from the archive in Los Angeles at UCLA, where the Sontag archive is. And one of the things I got to see was actually Sontag's computer, which is really weird. I mean, this is the new future of biography, is that you do this work on computers. But if you go ahead a little bit,
no,
keep going.
I think we're.
Let's see. We want this one. Nope.
Sorry.
I think we're clicking it. Yeah. No, almost that. This. So this says those who forget the movies of the past are condemned to watch their remakes. Well, I mean, this is just something kind of funny, but it's also, it shows you kind of what an archive looks like. Like,
this was a fragment that you found in her archive at UCLA. It's
just there in a file, in an envelope, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands of these pages of these things. So this is what a biography is it's like a quilt, you know, you take these things and you make it into a story. And if you know, you have the computer, you have these, can we go back to the little, wait, maybe I can do it. So this is Susan as a little girl with a handwriting exercise. You know, you see behind this very formidable figure that she became as a grown-up, this little girl. And that's the kind of thing that keeps you grounded in the feelings that you have about her, because you know that she's just another little girl from, in this case, this was probably in Arizona, who's doing the best she can. But getting these glimpses of the actual person, emotionally, it becomes really important. Can we go? But
also, Ben, you interviewed hundreds of people for the Susan biography, right?
Yeah, it's appalling. I interviewed 573 people, and that was just the people. A lot of them I encountered or talked to dozens of times, and that's one of the really interesting things about this process is that biographies are about relationships. The relationship that you have with the person you're writing about, but also with all their friends and family. And it's very emotionally electric sometimes. I wanted to show a picture of just one example of this, but I think a really shocking, I think shocking example. If you can find that picture of, yeah, here.
This one.
So this is Judith Cohen, who's Susan's sister. And I was living in Los Angeles, and I went out to Hawaii, where she lived, to interview her and meet her. And there was this light coming in. It's actually a better picture than it looks like here. It's really pretty. You can really see her face really well. It's really sharp. The light comes in and I think, oh, that's pretty. And I pick up my phone to take a picture of her. And I didn't know what she was doing. She was talking on the phone. And at that moment, she kind of drops the phone and she looks away like this. So what had happened is that she had just heard that her husband of 50 years had died in the moment that I took that picture. And so all of a sudden, I didn't know this woman like 15 minutes before I took this picture. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting, like I'm no longer, I just realized my knee is in this picture. I didn't even see that before. But, you know, it's just a little picture you take with your phone. And all of a sudden, my relationship to her is totally transformed. I mean, she becomes this vulnerable widow. You know, when I walked in the door, she wasn't a widow, and now she is. And so my role changes. You know, suddenly I'm the one trying to help her talk to the hospital, talk to the insurance people, and talk to the funeral home. And I don't even remember, but it's, you know, and this woman who's very upset for, I mean, she was a cool customer, I have to say. She's a great woman. And she came to my book party in New York. She now lives in Florida, and she came up. And, but it's funny.
There were a lot of people you interviewed for this book, though, who were, I mean, this is a poignant, terrible, tragic moment. But I mean, there were a lot of people who felt like they owned Susan and that were really stakeholders in her story. I mean, that must have been really complicated. And also to have 500 people that you've interviewed. I mean, were there any points in writing the biography, like, I don't know how many years you spent on it, but where you just felt like you were drowning in information, and how are you ever going to get out of it?
Well, that happens with every biography, because at a certain point you just have so much information, and you actually know, in a way, you know more about that person than they knew. Because it's like when you find emails from 2011, you don't remember that. But, you know, because you live your life forward, and the biographer lives your life backward again. And you get so many voices in your head. And especially with Sontag, you know, people really, really hated her. And people also really, really worshiped her. And there's these real extremes, you know. So I'm trying to be the person that's trying to give everybody, I mean, everybody I think is reliable and honest, because, you know, with biographers with famous people, you get a lot of people who are fake, you know, who just want to be in the book, who want to like tell their story. And sometimes you get to know, you get to feel who those people are, but it's not always obvious at first. And then, you know, you get people really fighting you for their half paragraph. Not everybody, I mean, but there's always a few people who felt like they should have been, their story was more important, or their perspective was more important. Somebody said to me the other day that Susan Sontag is the ultimate contested territory. So, you know, she's like Alsace-Lorraine, or like, you know, like Tibet. You know, people are always like fighting over it. And
let me back up and just to let people know, if they have questions for Ben, please put them in chat, and you can send them either directly.
Yeah, I haven't seen. Oh, this chat. Okay.
Yeah. But just to back up and ask you a question, like as a two-part question. You know, you're something very unusual, which is a man who writes principally about women's lives. And I wonder what that journey has been like for you. Have people found it strange? Why do you think you're drawn to women's lives? And what you've said to me before, that women's lives are shaped differently, maybe because of childbearing. I mean, what have you learned about kind of the shape of women's lives? And
well, this is something, one of the reasons I feel a sort of missionary interest in this is that I read in a great book by Carolyn Halbrun called Writing a Woman's Life, that until 1970, and this is so amazing to me, 1970, there were no biographies of women who weren't either married to somebody famous, like a queen, or a, you know, Eleanor Roosevelt or somebody like that, or, you know, women who were famous in their own right. It was always as an appendage to a man. And so even though we've had almost 50 years of this archaeology, there's still so much that people don't know. And there's still so many, even these figures that you think are really well known. My interest in it, you know, my first interest was in Clarice Lispector herself, just as this figure. And then I realized all this. And I think that it's important. I think when I was writing about Clarice, everybody was really complimentary. They thought, oh, that's so great, you're writing about a woman. And then 10 years go by, and my book came out last year, the Sontag biography, and people say, how dare you write about a woman? So that just gives you an interesting view on, that's just one little example, but like in the last 50 years, the word woman, the word Jew, the word lesbian, the word American, the word communist, like all these words that you think mean something that you know what they mean, they don't mean what you think they mean. So that becomes really fascinating. Like what it means to be a woman in 1960 is really different from being a woman now.
And we have a question from one of my favorite writers, Sheila Heti. How do you organize your notes and your research and keep it all in your head?
Oh, there's a program called Scrivener where you just put it all in there. The organization is the most important thing. And it's funny, it's Sheila asking this because I feel like Sheila, your books so much are about having too much information and just like narrowing it down until you find what it's really about. And I think that's something that the risk of that, of not being organized, it makes a difference between being able to write it or not, if you're not organized. And so I actually paid somebody this time to transcribe all my interviews because I thought if I have to do that myself, I will actually lose my mind.
Isadora asked, did you read any biographies before you started on the one about Clarice? I'm not sure if she means about Clarice, or were there other biographies of Clarice that you could draw on in Portuguese?
Yeah, there were a few, and I mean, she's a very famous figure. So there was a lot of stuff that was out there about her, but I always felt that it was missing a lot that my own perspective on her. But I always loved biographies. I think biographies are really fun to read. And the more you write them, the more you are able to read them, I think.
Do you think that you're up for another biography, another like 5-year deep dive into the life of another person?
No. The short answer is no. I'm really wanting to do something different because I think the intensity of a biography, somebody said that biographies are like marriages. You can only have like 2, maybe 3 in a life, which I felt like was high. No, I love biographies. I just, there's something about the commitment that it just becomes hard. Like Clarice, we've published now 12 of her books, plus my biography. And that's an ongoing thing. I mean, we bring out a book every year. And, I'm never done with her and I'm never going to be done with Susan. To have somebody else like that it's just a big responsibility.
Do you ever feel like you're losing your life by sort of giving yourself over to these other lives? Is there any?
I mean, there's a risk of that. Like I've seen that happen with biographers where they kind of become non-persons in service to this thing, which is often, people like who have a famous parent often have that risk, or people who are only identified as being beautiful or only identified as being rich, and that's all anybody sees when they look at them. But I don't feel that way because I think that both of these books are in some ways about me, and especially a lot of my intellectual interests that I've been able to pursue through writing about other characters. So, yeah.
So someone is asking you, who did you dedicate your Susan Sontag book to and why? I thought that was an intriguing question.
Oh, that's so funny. I don't get the, I'm seeing some of the questions now. I dedicated it to my partner, Arthur Japin, who maybe is here, maybe isn't, but maybe watching somewhere. And to my dear, dear, dear friend, Michelle Cormier, who I grew up with and who died a few years ago, just age 38. So I'm really happy to have her name in that book because I really loved her.
Fernanda asks, how did your views of Sontag change in the course of writing the biography? I mean, was this a book where you went through different phases of feeling differently about Susan as you moved chronologically through different phases of her life?
Yeah, because I think that when you really care about somebody and you really want somebody to do her best, because you're sort of the proud parent in a way when you're a biographer. You're you have this person's life in your hands, and you're also, what's going to happen to the person. This is kind of weird. Like if she's dating somebody and that person is terrible and is going to be mean to her, you're like, don't date her, like, go get away, like stop. And so your views seem sort of dishonest in a way because that she's doing something wrong sometimes that's going to hurt her. And you really don't want that to happen. And then you can get really angry when she does it anyway, because you're like, you should have listened to me. And then you think, oh, that happened in 1961. Like, and I wasn't born and you're now dead. So my feelings about this, I should probably kind of leave aside. But it's inevitable because you're so close to these people. you're so close to them and you get in fights with them and you have like romantic weekends with them where you just think they're the greatest thing in the world. I mean, it's very, you go through all these.
You'll never meet them. I mean, you wrote about
Yeah,
two women who were dead, who were just sort of recently alive, but who you'll never have a chance
to never meet them. That's really weird. I mean, Susan is in Paris, Montparnasse, and Clarice
she's buried there.
She's buried there. And Clarice is in Rio, sort of between the airport and the places where I usually stay. And, you know, even before I get to town in Rio, I usually go and leave a stone on her grave. So they're not at all gone. And I think a biography in general is a way to keep people alive. It's a way to record them because it's amazing how many people, my book just came out in September, the Susan book. How many people in my acknowledgements are dead already? Because often, you know, you're interviewing elderly people and so, yeah.
Someone else asked, and I think this is a great question, what your favorite Clarice Lispector book is, especially for somebody who's never read Clarice before. What would you recommend they read first?
Well, my first book that I read, and the first one I translated in the new series, is The Hour of the Star. It's 100 pages long. Not even, actually, it's like 80 pages long. And it is so fabulous. And if you don't know her, you'll meet her there. And this is her, she actually talks about this in the interview. Actually, I see somebody asked if the interview is available to see the rest. Yes, it's on YouTube. Just put in Clarice Lispector interview. She talks about this book that comes out right before she died. If you don't like it, which a lot of people don't like it because they just have different tastes, don't worry about it. It takes you like an hour. But if you do like it, then it'll become, if you feel the real appeal of her, which is really a powerful emotional force in people's lives. I'm very much not the only one who feels this way. Then you have a lot to look forward to.
I feel like she's sort of like the Jewish mystical writings, like you're not allowed to read her until you're 40 because you can't handle that level of death or something.
Yeah, I mean, that's not wrong. I mean, Clarice, you know, she's a writer a lot of people, Brazilians, read in high school because she's such an important national writer. And so, you know, you have to read certain writers to graduate from high school. But I have to say, like, one of the nice things about working with the translations over the years is that she changes as you change. You feel a different, the reading you bring to it at 40 is very different from the reading you would bring to it at age 14. Very different. And it's really impressive that a writer can get that all in there.
What do you think that Susan would have made of the Me Too movement had she lived to see it? Do you think she would have been pleased?
You know, I think she would have hated it, especially now. I think that she was very much not somebody who believed in female vulnerability. And I think that, like, to a fault sometimes, she overperformed toughness. You know, she really didn't want to be seen as vulnerable or sad or backward or whatever because she was a woman. And that was how a lot of women were perceived and still are. She really stood for the powerful woman, the woman who didn't take, you know, crap from people. And that image that she created of herself, it's not always true in her own life, as it would never be for anyone. But I think the fact that she symbolized that woman for a lot of people. And I think she would have said, kick him in the balls. I mean, I hope so.
Do you think she's gonna, we probably have to wrap it up pretty soon, but just as a final question, do you think Susan is gonna stay relevant? Like, I know I have a 13-year-old, 14-year-old daughter, sorry, but who hasn't heard of her. Do you think a new generation of women will read her, possibly thanks to your biography as well?
Well, that's the whole point. I mean, if that doesn't work, then I feel like as a biographer, you haven't really done your job as a literary biographer. You're trying to keep this work alive. Susan Sontag wrote a book called Illness as Metaphor in 1977 after she herself almost died of breast cancer when she was only 42. Illness as Metaphor is the most relevant book right now to read to try to understand how language and how the words we use, whether it's in politics or journalism or any other kind of speech, how that can actually kill people. You know, and one example that it's like, I almost wish, I'm glad she didn't live to see it, but I kind of wish she'd lived to see Trump talking about maybe you should inject Clorox to cure your, I mean, that's a really extreme example, but that is that's language. That's language telling people to do things that are dangerous. And it's such an extreme example that you kind of lose sight of all those subtle ways that you can use diseases to shame people or to exclude people or to make them think it's their fault that they're sick, which was very common with cancer.
It'd be very nice to have Susan now to talk about and take on Trump.
We do have her. I mean, I know I sound like a mystic, you know, crystal ball reader, but these people are still there. Their books are still there and their legacies are still there. And I think it's really on us to try to keep that alive, because otherwise you lose so much thought and so much richness. Let's see. What are people saying here?
I think we're going to have to close it down in a minute. You're getting a lot of appreciation for Brazilians. Thank you for keeping sharing Clarice with the world.
Oh, I see someone saying, what's my favorite book? Well, I recommend one, and you said mine is An Apprenticeship or The Book of Pleasures. Diego, I guess, I don't know, I don't see you, but maybe you're there. That is the next one coming out in the series. So
great. Well,
it was going to be this year. It's now going to be whenever.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to have to close it down. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time slot. But thank you, first of all, Ben, for maybe you'll tell us what that mysterious is. That an elephant, a dead elephant covered in a
No, it's
carpet?
Crap on it that I decided to cover with a blanket so that I didn't have to clean up my whole house in honor of Pandemonium U.
Well done. Okay, we appreciate it. Well, thank you for the visuals. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with me and with all of us. It's fascinating. I've known you for a long time, but there's so much I didn't know about your professional life and your working life. I recommend both of your biographies very strongly to anyone who's listening right now. And thank you everyone out there for being part of another session of Pandemonium U. We have another class on Wednesday with Sandra Singlo talking about the science of pandemics. It's for kids and adults, but it's going to be especially kid-friendly. She has graduate students from the University of California in Irvine who are going to give a sort of tour of the history and science of pandemics, not just this one, but sort of how to make it interesting and maybe even go into science as a result of it. And on Friday, we have